Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Inverted Podcast, where we talk about products and businesses and things that help keep lots of people safe and systems clean, where success is when nothing happens. And today, as always, I'm joined by my friends Dario, Tom, and Dana. And we have a special guest today that we'll get to in a moment, Mark Risher. We're very honored for you to join Mark today, and we have lots of interesting questions for you. And Dario is even celebrating on Zoom here. And for those of you maybe chiming in for the first time or watching for the first time, you can find all of us on LinkedIn. We have a small inverted product community that you can join, and you can interact with all of us on LinkedIn. And as we go through the pod today, the opinions that we have are our own. We do not represent, our employers or clients or anybody else. We're just having a fun conversation about how to make the world a more secure place. And with that, I would first go to you, Mark. It's amazing to have you here. For those of you dialing in, Mark was the one who brought me originally to Google, and then he has moved on. What have you been up to, Mark? What are some of the things you've been doing?
Well, I moved to Europe. I'm living in Paris, France right now, and have a small startup that is focused on being an AI concierge for real world experiences, trying to use technology to get people off their screens and out in the real world, discovering new activities, new events, new things to do together.
Wow, that must have been an amazing experience. What was kind of the biggest difference from going from Google back to a startup? What's something that you've really enjoyed? What's been hard? Like,
The biggest difference, I mean, it's all quite cliche, which is just the pace. You forget how much faster, faster can be. Where I would still be in this mindset of like, great, we should try to do that next week, which was already an order of magnitude faster than maybe a Google project. And people would say, no, we should do that at lunch today. And so getting used to just a different pace of operation and a different risk appetite, like the fact that it's sort of not worth checking with the lawyers if this is covered or not, because the chances are that no one will see it. It has been just a different mindset to unwind, particularly coming from security, where we try to keep billions and billions of people safe.
yeah. Thanks for that. I think as we start, before we go into today's story, I think we have a bunch of questions. I think Dario, Dana, Tom, you had questions for Mark. So why don't you do some rapid fire with Mark here?
How do you balance? I mean, you mentioned the fast pace, you're trying to acquire users, like the balancing of trying to integrate security and that type of thought. I mean, you mentioned how large services run, like do you see that impacting you day to day? And what are your processes around that, or how do you think about that?
It's terrible and tragic, but I am often the person saying, let's not worry about the security until we see if it's a problem. After years and years of preaching secure by default, and it's so much easier to put it in at the beginning, which is definitely true. I think I was kibitzing before you started recording that I'm having this OAuth issue in our code stack, and I'm like commenting out certificate verifications, just trying to get it to work, which, my rational brain is like, this is ridiculous, but another part of me is saying, like, when there's too many barriers in the way and they aren't actually risk appropriate, then of course people are going to work around it. And I know the same from our authentication world, where, if it's easier to share one password with the whole admin team, that's what people will do. And you have to kind of find that right ROI.
So the RI
Ask
is
for
still finding it.
forgiveness.
It's a bit different in this case. And then Dario, I think you had the next question that you wanted
Yeah,
to ask.
yeah. I mean, building a bit up on that previous question, like, how have your expectations towards vendors changed when it comes to security? I'm pretty sure you're aware of the like SSO wall of shame, where people say companies shouldn't charge extra for single sign-on because it's a table stake on security. Like, previously having been on the vendor side, like providing features to clients, some of them B2B, some of them B2C, and now you're on the other side. Has that changed your perception on how security should be offered?
Yeah, I mean, maybe so. I seldom see that there's an upgraded price for a two-factor, but what I frequently see is very poorly, naively implemented two-factor. So many of our services now require it, but in a very burdensome way. Like every single time you log in or every single time you visit the profile page, you're waiting for a code to come to your phone, typing in the 6-digit OTP. And so it seems like there's this very naive implementation that probably comes from a bit of a, CYA, or I read a blog post that like security is important without actually thinking how it's going to apply.
Tom?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious in the context, especially of your new endeavor, Mark. I mean, for me, and maybe I'm a particularly sensitive user, but like security is kind of like a core value proposition when you're talking about like an AI supported like offering or application, right? So do you think that that's something going forward, that when you're trying to market this, in the same way that Apple does, its iPhone, its privacy, is that going to be something that's a core of like a differentiator for your product, or is it something that you're not thinking about?
I think that the privacy aspects are paramount, and like what we do with the data, what we collect, and how it works is super important. And I think that authentication and basic security for the system is super important. So I was being flippant earlier in saying we're commenting out the checks, really because I'm just trying to get this one bug to pass for this afternoon. But that said, there's so many cases of people getting it wrong. I absolutely understand. I mean, even just now, what was it? I think Scale.ai just got caught with some public to the world storage buckets and Google Docs and different things that they've misconfigured because it's so easy when you're 10 people sitting around a table to assume that none of this matters, and then suddenly next thing you know, it matters. So yes, I think it's super important. I do think the company needs to focus on this, and while I am being glib, I hopefully from a decade of working in the Google security stack, my idea of cutting corners is still hopefully above threshold for a lot of these features.
No, but like glibness is definitely good. But I think even specifically, do you think that will be a differentiator that you'll talk to like customers about? Like, that, with this application, your data isn't going anywhere, or this is in an end user friendly way. This is how we kind of secure the boundary.
That I don't know. So we're building a consumer application, if that wasn't clear, like
Yeah.
a mobile app, and we are actively experimenting with how salient these concepts are. For example, just today we were trying a feature where you can upload your photos. And I know from working at Google and the brief time I was leading the Android UI team that give access to only individual pictures, that is a relatively new feature that both Android and iOS have, because the whole photo album is quite a lot of crown jewels. But we're finding that users are still not quite sensitive. It's 2025, and yet they're like, well, one of them I have to do work, and the other one I just give you access and you do it. Like, it's not clear. So long story short, I don't know if users do always view that as better, and instead, similar to my ROI comments on B2B, the B2C users may think that sometimes the security stuff just gets in their way.
Well, is it also a matter of trust, Mark? Like where they just trust the app and you're in an early stage, right? So I'm assuming that lots of your users might still somehow know the founding team or at least can find something, and they just trust you to do the right thing with their pictures. They trust you not to download their full photo album and then train an AI on it to then sell that as an image generation product on the back end or stuff like that.
I don't think that's it. I mean, it's possible, and it would be nice and flattering, but I see, daily cases of the sorts of things people are typing into ChatGPT that are going into those logs, typing into any, chatbot app that they've installed. I think that people are not that sensitive, and we and our companies and our careers were built in part on trying to push the forefront, either because users cared, or just because it's the right thing to do. My sense is that users don't care that much yet. Somebody texted me yesterday because they were trying to buy a beer from a vending machine in Austria, and it asked them to scan their passport. And he sent me a picture of his wife holding up the passport to the scanner of a beer vending machine, saying, "Do you think this is safe?" But obviously she's already done it, so I don't think people care. unfortunately.
Let's hope the beer vending machine doesn't get hacked and get all the passports of the thousands of people that have been uploaded in the last couple of years. And let's hope they delete the picture after scanning. I think this
Exactly.
awareness is an interesting point, right? And today we want to talk about maybe some of the business models behind inverted products. And I think part of building an inverted product or a business that sells an inverted product or is creating that awareness. And Dana, I want to start with you today, if that's okay. Like, could you take us through some of the business models that you've seen and also the latest startup you were part of? Like, what kind of business model were they using to sort of sell an inverted product in a sense? Maybe remind people what you were doing before in your last endeavor also.
Before the last thing I was doing is working for a company that provided security features to other companies, commercial services and enterprise services. Um, and that was a kind of I won't call it a hosted model, but they used our security services that interacted with our services. So the customer wasn't hosting it themselves, although that's a possibility in the future. So it's kind of a managed security, and we also had a differentiator. And talking about business models, was we also had like a SOC or a operations team that was actively looking for threats, which is not something that a lot of security vendors do. It's kind of a different model that they had hybrid. Um, so going back to the different models, there's the one you acquire the licenses and run the security software or features on your own infrastructure or locally. There's one where there's another one where the services, the security services are hosted and you kind of integrate. And then there's a outsource model where you like send everything out and someone else is running all your security services for you and monitoring and just letting you know things happen. And that goes like there's an extreme part of that, whereas not only are they monitoring stopping things but also doing automatic remediation, which is I think where everybody wants to be, so that someone you're basically out the security products are outsourcing your own security operations, your own all the things that your employees have to do as a company to protect a service. And I think that's a lot of companies would love to get to that final that end state, but that's probably the hardest one to implement. Did I miss any
Well, I
remarks?
think I wanted to ask Tom because you must see most business models of all of us in your line of work, and so Dana just painted the picture for us. Like either you pay per seat or you pay a bit more, and then the final spectrum is like I just pay a fee and the company takes care of my security. What are you seeing? Are we missing anything or?
Like in terms of other options that weren't mentioned, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think the interesting thing that is happening in a lot of the clients that we're discussing with at the moment is to what extent do they want to like develop people internally as security experts and engineers and network architects and so on versus moving to that service layer because ultimately we're seeing like a lot of commodification from the largest vendors trying to move towards kind of like what you would call security platform level vendors, so not necessarily concerned with one or other part of the IT infrastructure or the end user facing compute, but just kind of doing an entire kind of like security as a service almost model. So Microsoft does this, for example, in a lot of its products at the moment, and you'll see kind of like in the identity space, companies like Savient, like SailPoint, are trying to kind of like consolidate around having all of those offerings within a single pane of glass. So the question that companies are kind of working on is like, do I really need someone who is kind of like, to a certain extent, like solution agnostic, right? Who is capable across a couple of different areas of like security architecture or network architecture, or do I need someone who configures this tool and then the tool does the rest? You know?
Mark, I have a question for you because you had a security company before you joined Google. What was your approach? And if you would start it again, would you take the same one or would you take a different one?
Our approach, you mean by the question, the sort of pricing approach, or how much do people have to think about it?
Well, I guess both things. Like, what was your business model, and maybe say a few words of what you were doing because people might not know, and like how are you appropriating some of the value you create, and would you do anything different right now if you would do it
Sure.
again?
So our approach was very much that platform type model that both Tom and Dana were mentioning. We would pitch people. So our general premise was protecting web properties from account hijacking and content and abuse issues. And this grew out of time when I was at Yahoo, where I was running the Yahoo Mail, but focused on the anti-spam and phishing platform and all these different abuse. And we realized that everything that could go wrong with the mail system was expanding to social networks and comments and posting and microblogging and all this stuff. So our general sales pitch was, actually remember we would talk about this sort of cycle of abuse where a company, frequently a startup or someone that had just launched a product that was starting to get attention, they would come in one morning and they would see that some terrible problem had happened. It was covered with cryptocurrency spam, or it was covered with abusive images or posts that they didn't want, and they would quickly go and write a quick rule, regular expression pattern to remove it, and they'd be like, phew, that's better, and they would be fine for a few days, and then they'd come back and there would be even more, and they'd say, what do we do? And somebody would raise their hand and say, I took a machine learning class in university, I'm going to fix this. And they would go and spend a week and build something, and it would be fine for a few days, and then it would come back again. And our sales pitch was, how often do you want to keep doing that? And kind of towards Tom's point of like, do you want to train experts in-house, and do you want to be trying to keep them up to date with what are the state-of-the-art types of attacks and the types of techniques that are being used? Or would you rather focus on what is core and let somebody else specialize in this? And interestingly, when I went to Google and we took over then effectively a SaaS company within Google, like we were the core anti-abuse team working with clients like Gmail and the Play Store and YouTube and Google Maps, etc. We had the same approach. YouTube or a Maps would say like, hey, we've got some ML people, we can build this. And we'd say, yeah, but do you really want to be funding a team that is only monotonically going to be getting bigger? Or would you rather have sort of centralized expertise that can handle this, that has a big enough team they can send someone to a conference and find out what's happening, or they can do investigations and research into the dark web and what new techniques are evolving and kind of stay abreast? And we felt like this critical mass approach really generally did work, and we were able to then go to people and say, maybe you could specialize, but if you don't really want to and you don't really have to, isn't it better to put it in a central place?
And so then how would you appropriate some of the value that you would get? Would you like charge per email that they send you to evaluate? Would you do a flat fee? And like how did you do that? And would you do the same way again?
So we definitely did not charge per email or per thing they asked us to evaluate, because it felt like that created this contrary incentive. We'd say like, hey, we're going to handle it, only send us the stuff you can't deal with. And actually some early customers tried to do that to keep their bills low. And it was the worst of all worlds. They would like run their, janky cobbled together, parsing engine, and then they would send the false negatives to us, and then they'd complain when we got it wrong, or they'd send only the false positive. We have this bias sample, and it was very difficult. So we quickly tried to move into much more of a flat price, and to try to say, really, it's more solutions oriented, which I think is what general B2B pricing tries to be. Like, we're going to solve the problem for you. How much is that worth? Instead of some sort of transactional token-based thing that creates these perverse incentives.
So you were trying to solve this problem. Tom, we have Tom and Dana afterwards. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, sure.
Completely I agree with that. And what we see a lot, Mark, right, is like the service orientation, right? Which is to say not the technical platform, but like what is our functional output. The other thing that was kind of interesting to me about what you were saying is that like, this idea of like, why do we need to train people internally? And like, for example, X vendor knows security far better than we ever will. It's not a core competency. That's certainly something that we hear a lot from clients. But what's also interesting to me is that like it's not unusual necessarily because they're single points of failures for these vendors to be disproportionately targeted by like you know, persistent threat actors and so on. And so far, to take an explicit example, like from the identity field, in the last 18 months, like Okta has had a very difficult time in terms of breaches, but it hasn't so far really affected their business levels, which is
Yeah.
kind of interesting. And I would like your view on the view of the other learned colleagues on the call.
I mean, there are all these kind of maxims and truisms like don't put all your eggs in one basket, which
Mm.
suggests that, you know, yes, the central hub is going to get targeted, and maybe there's like a kind of herd immunity if you know, everyone uses different services. The problem, though, is that each of the different services, kind of by definition, is much smaller and has much less ability to defend themselves. And so while they're less of a target, they're also a softer target. So I think a better example might be more like a bank. Like you could hide your money by putting, you know, 100 euros in the freezer, or 100 euros under your mattress, 100, you know, in the garage. But that's really a security by obscurity type thing. Probably better to put it in a bank where they've got professional guards and they've got professional, you know, vaults and alarm systems. And it's true that banks attract more attackers, but also they're a much harder target. So, you know, the metaphors break down a little bit.
Dario.
Yeah, and it's probably much more likely that your garage is being flooded than the bank is being robbed. So it doesn't, at the end, it doesn't matter if your money gets destroyed by fire or water, or it gets
Well
somebody
put.
else. And I think the whole aspect of how niche a lot of these subjects are was one of the elements that not surprised me, but like was most eye-opening for me, like coming from organizations like at Google, the identity team with 100 engineers, like building login and sign up and risk signals, and then later at Facebook with similar size teams looking at that. But for everybody outside, identity, for example, is a niche topic. Like, I mean, what percentage of your engineering time, Mark, do you want to spend on making sure that the login flow works? Hopefully less than 5 or
Yeah.
2, probably closer to 1 over a long time. So I think there's also, when it comes to these platforms and business models, we have to remember that on the client side, the problem is a niche problem that's unlikely their core business. Like if you're a retailer, if you're a retailer and with like brick and mortar shops all over the country, identity is a niche for you. But I think what I often see, and I would really be curious about you guys' take, is people just want to throw away the problem and make somebody else care for it, but they need to have some understanding of what the problem is. They don't have to be the ones that can implement a FIDO server or can implement the OAuth integration, because as we now learned from Mark, that's not still in 2025, still not that standard. But they need to understand what can they expect from their vendors. And then do you think that understanding is there, or is there an over-reliance on vendors and saying, you guys are the experts and you just tick the box and keep me secure?
I don't think it's an over-reliance, but I think that's the answer to Tom's question. Like, despite the fact that a company like Okta or anyone else may have issues, it's still desirable to not have to focus on that, to not have, you know, identity be core. I think one of the challenges with identity is that it is deceptively complicated, or maybe deceptively simple is the expression. Like, people, you know, don't think about it when you're first prototyping your application. You slap a username and password field up there and hope not to have to think about it for a few years. And that is, I think, part of the challenge, that it seems so simple, but it's also so central to your, you know, security posture and to how you protect and how you, you know, manage all of your traffic. So it's not salient, it's not central in their mind. They want someone else to handle it. And I guess I'm arguing it's better when someone else handles it. Like, one of my proudest achievements, and I only take a tiny sliver of credit for it, is sign in with Google, which is like growing like gangbusters. Like every product has it, and as a user, I love it, and I love it for two reasons. I love it because as just a naive user, it's so much more convenient and so much better than having to remember a password and figure out how many symbols and numbers they want at this particular place versus the other. And even with a password manager, like does it comply with their policy, et cetera? And then secondly, as a practitioner, I know that it's so much better that the only thing that can possibly get breached is now, a token that can be expired as opposed to a long-lived credential that's probably, reused on many different sites. And so I'm really happy when everyone outsources. Now, it does mean that Google is a target. It does mean that individuals' Google accounts are a target, but I still think that they're in a much better place than the alternative. And similar, Dario, to what you said about your garage getting flooded, like the biggest likelihood that you get breached somewhere is not a massive security attack. It's a misconfiguration. It's spammers just credential stuffing. It's a database that's accidentally uploaded in clear text. Like these sorts of pieces, and having those all kind of out of the picture makes everyone's security much better.
Yeah, and I can say that I even sometimes skip on services if they don't have to sign in with Google button. I just take one because I just don't want to create another credential. And I have a few hundred now in my password manager that are where I can't sign in with Google. Dana, you're up next.
Sure. So much great topics and things being discussed. At some point, maybe for another podcast, we should get back to the centralized security model versus distributed, because that's a really interesting topic. But as you were talking and going back to like business models, I was thinking about licensing, and there's when you the licensing you charge to protect an end consumer product for security versus what you charge an end user for your security or service versus what you charge an enterprise is kind of different. And like enterprises want like a per user or per machine fee that you charge them. And when you're charging like to secure, if you have a service to charge another service, you want to do connections because those, for instance, take that there's a lot of cost in each connection. And then like if you're building a consumer service like you're doing now and you want to like minimize, put the smallest cost you can to a user, for probably a lot of different things to try to make it attractive. And just curious about your insight or things you've done in those different areas or thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, as a startup, I was really afraid to sign up for something that would charge me per user. Even though we had 0 users, like I didn't, it felt like I could see their business model. It was like showing through. You're like, oh, I'm going to get stuck and it's going to be really hard to get off of you. And then you're going to charge, maybe 90% or 80%, but still something that's sloping like this. And I'm incredibly cheap. I mean, Yurin and Dario can probably testify if they ever got a t-shirt from me, it was probably someone else on my team because I don't exactly. And I'm sorry if you'd like a T-shirt, we can talk after the pod. So I was really cheap, and so when I was looking just for like our simple prototype proof of concept Flutter application, I deliberately didn't take a bunch of these managed identity platforms that said your first 1,000 users are free, then you pay 10 cents per user per month, because I was like, oh my God, if we're successful, that's terrible. And I didn't want to like get into that. And so that's similar to what I guess, Tom, you and I were saying a moment ago of like trying to price for the solution. Now, obviously the solution and the value is proportionate to the number of users or seats. And so there is always going to be a positive correlation there, but trying to find a way as a B2B buyer, I would much rather have flat prices with tiers instead of something that feels like so directly transactionally coordinated with like my success is also a failure.
Why would you be afraid of when you're successful you pay more, when you're not successful you don't pay more? I was discussing business models with someone today, and I said, if you can make it so that when the customer is successful, then they pay more, because you take part of the value that you create for them. In this case, the identity provider would create the value they create is a solid identity system.
Yep.
And if of course you have to have little things like, oh, dormant users don't count, for example, or there must be some guardrails. But if someone's bringing you a lot of value, why would you mind paying a lot of money? It's if you grow to 10 million users, like, and I'm not saying dormant ones, but active ones that are actually bringing value to your platform.
Yeah.
I get,
So I mean, part of it might just be like an emotional reaction to the knowledge, like they're charging, per row in a database, like just the, millions of orders of magnitude higher than the actual cost, and maybe just that sort of feeling. But I think more closely, it is what you're saying about Dormant, that, particularly as a consumer application, I don't know yet what the, value that I get from a new user. And so if I'm charged for everyone who signs in, and I'm only converting, well, I'm converting X%, but I don't know what X is, like, how do I attach something to that? And, if I'm converting them in an ad-supported business where I need, 10,000 users to make $1, or if I'm converting them in a subscription business where I need 100 users to make $1, like, their price is the same, and I know their cost is very close to zero, their marginal cost is close to zero. It's just something that felt, lopsided. Again, I should stipulate, and I did at the beginning, like, I'm also just cheap and was just trying to avoid, unnecessary services. But this felt like one that we could easily get kind of stuck and lose the negotiating leverage. And the value that they're providing was very squishy for me. It wasn't really obvious.
Dario, you had your hand up.
Yeah, Mark touched on that point. And I think when I talk to early stage founders, it's especially in the consumer space, they often don't know yet what the value is per customer or per user they're getting. How much can they monetize? Like, so how much budget do you have for one specific person? And then if you're spending 50% of that budget on an identity service, that's just such a fractional part of the value chain, then then you're ruining your business. I mean, we've seen that also in sometimes larger organizations when, I don't know, cost of SMS spikes up. Like we all think SMS is cheap and is free, but not if you want to send out 2FA codes. And if you then end up spending hundreds of millions or closer to billions for SMS, some of your customers, for some or users, that still might be a positive, still leave you quite a lot of margin, but for some it might not. And so I think especially in an early stage to look at where is the cash out going is probably very important, or I think is a very important thought process, because otherwise you're going to you're going to have surprises, and getting rid of these functionalities is going to be more expensive than on a later stage if you have to.
I think that's a great analog, because even at a gigantic company that I worked at, we, with many economists and accountants and finance people, we struggled to have a straight line financial equation for how many SMS is it worth, and what is it, if we're sending an average of 24 per year at 10 cents per, is that like a good deal or a bad deal? Like, even with a gargantuan company, it's hard to know.
Yeah, it might be a good deal for a US user where the ad income is higher, but if you're like in, I don't know, in Myanmar or in Jakarta, where the ad revenue per user is lower, then the 24 text messages that may be even more expensive because it's a niche carrier.
Routed through a small country's telecom network. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So besides the 1% that you should be spending on engineering, in your startup to identity, you should also try to make sure you don't spend more than 1% of your cost on the security software to keep you safe, especially being careful that you don't get trapped in a hockey stick that would go really high because of some KPI that is actually not representing the value that it's creating for you.
I mean, the terrible thing about security, which I think is the premise of this group, is that people would happily pay for security for the thing that happened in the past, but it's very hard to predict how much to pay for the thing in the future. And so, and we actually tried to model it that way. In fact, I think you and I might have talked about this, is like, go to someone who's had a breach and ask them how much would they pay to erase that. And one of the proxies that we thought about was like the bad PR when you have to go out and say, mea culpa, 100 million of our records were stolen and users' information's out there and we're paying for credit monitoring, blah, blah, blah. Like, maybe use that total as a way, but we could never really make it stick because no one ever thinks it'll happen to them until the day after, at which point, like, it's, impossible.
Yeah, we should go. We'll go to that in a moment. One encounter I wanted to add in there, Mark, is that I spoke to a CFO of a big company a few months ago, and they said whenever they have a potential account takeover, even if it's like a frontline worker or receptionist or someone, they have to get someone in to ensure that everything's good, and that starts at $250,000, and that's
Yep.
just to make sure nothing went wrong. So that's the minimum cost they incur. And I found other data points that that's kind of the right amount to say just the cost. We're not even talking about if it's really bad, what's the share price impact and all this. So yeah, Dana.
Yeah, so having that number is really helpful.
Yeah.
I wanted, like, Mark, you've done so much in the security space. I wanted to go back and kind of shift the question because I'm curious about your, your experience and response on this. We talked about how much it costs a user or you charge another customer, to use a security service. But what also fascinates me is, you're a PM building a security product for this large company. And you need to, I mean, you guys were just talking about like SMS costs and things like that. And you need to chart, you're costing your business and the larger company money for the security products. You want to do these initiatives, like your goals are different than their goals, like at an overall top level company, they're trying to grow their user base, but you're like, hey, my security product's going to go knock out, hundreds of thousands of users that are really bad. Like, it's you're kind of paddling upstream in security, trying to do your job and trying to align with the greater company. And I know you've been in the middle of that. I'm just curious about your experiences and thoughts on that, and what people trying to do that now should think about.
Well, I think being in the middle is the only way to crack it. And what I mean by that is, we got acquired into Google to lead the abuse and security and account hijacking. And then after a few months, some, very clever people, including my close friend and boss, Ben Smith, said, no, actually, you have to worry about the good users too, because having one person looking at both keeps it from getting so totally out of whack. And our company struggled then to like maintain that balance, and many other companies organize these things into two totally separate groups. The further apart they are, you've got a security team that's like, let's just block everyone, and no more headaches for us, and a growth team that's like, wow, we're off the charts, and this country with a population of 3 million people just signed up 100 million accounts, like fantastic, let's do marketing. And so you really, like, the closer those are together as two functions that probably don't get thought of directly, as related, seems almost essential. The problem is that the types of personalities that are attracted are quite different, and it's rare to get that into one world. You're talking about this inverted product manager where you're not really trying to make the number go down, but you were trying to make sure that only good users are coming through. And of course, at some level, everyone only wants good users. But if you go low enough, there are people that are willing to kind of turn a blind eye and be like, well, the aggregate growth is very big, and not pay attention to whether they're good users versus bad. And so again, like, I think needing somebody who can scrutinize and can synthesize those two together seems really, really important. Back when we had our startup in Permian, we were running into this with startups. Like, startups wanted the vanity metrics. They wanted to say, we got 100,000 signups yesterday. And, that was important for them. And I remember some calls where they were like, please don't put this in writing, essentially, because they didn't like, the truth showing through.
Right.
I think the truth
But then
is
you
hard
have like,
for. Go ahead, Dana.
well, you have like I want to challenge all new users to verify who they are, and like to get that approved through your org, maybe all the way up to your CEO, because they're like, well, we don't want any more friction, right? Like,
That's
even
right.
if you're together, there's still this thing, and you're still a cost center compared to all these other groups that are generating revenue for you. So it seems like there's a lot of push and pull in when being in the center, right?
There is, and so one of the ways to solve that is by pushing through metrics. So in our hijacking team, we had so at some point it's obviously going to split, because not every individual is both trying to grow users and block bad users. But what we tried to do is to have common shared metrics. we had a concept of a like user engagement score, essentially a value score that was computed by our growth team. And we spent a bunch of time in engineering getting that plumbed through to the anti-hijacking systems to try to have that common baseline. If each team has their own lens, then they're going to spin it in the direction that makes them look better. And so that was one of the sort of management efforts, was to say you only get points for good users. You don't get points for raw, unverified users. And then, of course, everyone should be saying we shouldn't be challenging the good users. We shouldn't make their lives miserable. This is what I was saying before about the naive two-factor. There's so many services where every single time I connect, I'm having to wait for a code to come on my phone and then type it. Plus, they like block copy paste because they read a blog post that says that that's dangerous, or whatever. These sorts of things are terrible, and that's that naive implementation when the controls team gets too much power.
It's about balance, I hear. And Dario, you had another something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just adding to that balance element. I mean, like you're mentioning, it, at some point an organization becomes too big to care about both growth and security or protection or compliance. And like I've seen organizations, or like I've seen certainly one organization where those two organizations have not even started at the same place, where you have a growth organization that is very powerful and has very is a crucial element of the strategy, and then a security organization. And have you, and that's not just for Mark, but like for everybody, have you seen organizations like that? And have you seen that they're building up language to talk to each other? Because that's, in my experience, that's then the important step, that you start to have language between growth and security or trust and safety or whatever you want to call that, to figure out how much is growth worth versus how much growth can we sacrifice in the to achieve higher security or higher compliance.
I can
Yeah,
definitely
have
take
you
that
seen
one.
one?
Recently, going through some of that things, like as you know, we're enforcing two-step verification for workspace admins, and we actually have established a common language with some of the other stakeholders here that could get impacted if we get this wrong. And we build dashboards and metrics, and we have clear guardrails so that when we go over, we pause or we give customers more time. And so we have established that common language together. And sometimes it takes VP level leaders to actually figure out that there's two people or two teams that should be talking to each other. They don't know. And if one would just go, then the other would come back later. And that's where I think senior management can be really, really strong added value, where they oversee such a big space and they say, oh, if these two come together and they don't, coordinate, it's going to be really ugly. So I think definitely I've seen this happen, and you have to find common metrics where you both agree that they're important for the business as a whole, but they need to coexist within a certain range together. And so if I cannot enforce anybody for 2SV, then obviously that's not good. But if there's other metrics that go down too much, then that's also not good. So we've defined the common set plus the guardrails, and then we're executing within those bounds, and it's going really well now.
Just an example of like challenges for trying to come in with common language. Like if you look something basic like active users, right? And like you might be like, hey, an active users, they log in twice a month. But you have other services that are like, well, if the user logs in every 6 months or a year, they're good because they need to get in to do their taxes, which they do like once a year, right? And so it really is a challenge to come up with some of these concepts that are work across, particularly when you're a large consumer company or enterprise company that a lot of other companies deal with, and you're handling lots of different workloads. But
especially for identity, because you don't know who it is until they succeed. So if they're trying and failing, you don't know if it's
it was a good user or not.
This also, the point that you just made, Dana, goes back to like some of the discussion we had earlier around like how people orient their tool choices around this. And one of the things that like you'll see when you kind of like more heavily orient to like an out of the box experience for some of the key tools is like we've discussed this before, like you use this element of flexibility that may be like really important to the way your business or your customer base like interacts with the service. Because like you can see, for example, like based on best practice, you'll often see the guidance being, well, don't force someone to re-authenticate unless there's a good reason, right? and not just an arbitrary, time duration, but like, some other signal on the identity. But like, in order to actually adhere to that best practice, you need really good tooling in most cases, and or you need, like, smart people thinking about it. And otherwise, you can take an out of the box solution that's going to say, okay, you're going to have to re-authenticate or change password every 90 days, and but problem solved.
Right.
Right. Just to expand on that and what you were talking about is like you might, as a security person, want them to re-authenticate like every week or every month just to make sure that the connection's secure. But if the business and the user patterns, like, hey, the user logs in every 3 months, or like you might have like frontline workers or things like that log in like every 3 months, every 6 months, and they're always getting challenged. And that's a problem, because the kind of what you did to improve security as a service is like detrimental to some of the users logging in, because they always get challenged, or always have issues. So
So
it really
we've
is
talked about a lot
huge.
today. And we are getting close to the end. We started, talking about the intention today was to talk about business models, and we ended up touching on a lot of inverted PM subjects. We talked about the critical attacker journey and how to make sure we don't kick real users out, but we keep them in. We talked about the balance there. We talked about the value of security and how to purchase security. We've talked about, do you raise up your own experts or do you centralize this? We've talked about how to engage with PAs. I think anybody that's in any security role has a lot to take away today. I want to thank Mark for taking an afternoon
Thanks,
and
Mark.
to join us. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to tell the audience, or if they want to get in touch with you, anything?
No, I mean, I'm happy to be here, happy to share. I haven't been able to go as deep on some of these topics for a few years now, and so it's interesting, and it's so fascinating. Again, I'm one of these people that initially thought, how hard can identity be? And continue finding new dimensions. I was just talking to someone yesterday who's figuring out identity and authentication for MCP, this new tool protocol for artificial intelligence. And like, it's just everything, like, so fascinating. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you for joining, and thank you for listening wherever you are or looking at this podcast. As always, if you want to get in touch with us, give us feedback. You can find us all on LinkedIn and the community. Thanks to my friends Dario, Dana, and Tom. And thanks again, Mark, for joining us today. And see you all in the next one.